Hi everybody. Okay, so we're back. This is Module 2, Video 1. I've decided to do the videos by book. So all of the material in this video is from Utterback, Mastering the Dynamics of Innovation. You guys were assigned the introduction in Chapter 1 of this book. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this video. And then we will do the Rogers video and the Courier video separately. So hopefully it'll make it a little bit easier for you guys to follow along. So Utterback, which I think I've mentioned this before, is one of my favorite books, and I think he does an excellent job of helping us to understand what happens in innovation. This graph itself is really important in the reading. The Chapter 1 goes through the dynamics of innovation in the typewriter slash word processor slash PC with word processing software space. And you see this curve over and over again in the reading. Well, actually, it's not in the reading, obviously, but if you're following along in the reading, you see the impact of this curve. So in every one of these situations, even in the very beginning with the actual typewriter, what you see is the emergence of a design that is the product innovation that then becomes standardized, and you see companies improving their process innovation to make the product more affordable for the market. So then we'll switch to the next one. Then another product comes along. So here's where we are at the top of the S curve from the other chart. Another product comes along that interrupts the existing product. So this is electric typewriters interrupting manual. This is the introduction of word processors over the electric typewriter. This is the introduction of the PC over the word processor. So always the invading product starts out at a lesser point. And a lot of times, sometimes this is the product itself. It is just less capability. But sometimes this is just about, the training and the existing, basically status quo in the industry that puts the new product at a slight disadvantage to the established product. So the invading product comes in at a lesser point, and then over time exceeds the capabilities of the existing product, and then moves into its own S-curve. Then we go down to the bottom here. This is now the established product, which in this case moved from the electric typewriter the manual typewriter to the electric typewriter to the word processor to the IBM PC. And I know many of you are very young and probably don't remember any of these products at all. I was there for a lot of them, so I got to see a lot of this innovation, which was really interesting, because you see the beginning of status quo bias, which is this is what I'm used to and I'm not going to take anything else regardless of the capability. I remember in one situation, I was actually working for IBM, so there's a lot of IBM in Chapter 1. And when this book was written, was I still working there? They're referring to the times that I was at IBM. So I was there during a lot of this innovation, and it was really interesting to watch from a sales perspective, because I'm constantly interacting with the people to figure out, how to get this new product to market. And what I noticed was one kind of glaring example was I was working in what was called the IBM Product Center, which was a very unusual setting where IBM had set up storefronts and people came in to buy products directly. So an individual person could buy a product from IBM, which generally speaking was hard to do. IBM was a business-to-business company. They would go call on Ford, they would call on GM, Whirlpool, and anybody else. And that was the way they did business. And so an individual person really couldn't buy from IBM, but they established these product centers and they were able to sell directly to the public. So I remember one day a secretary and her boss came in. I don't know what it is, like I start recording and Quinn has to go out. Okay, I guess she doesn't like my lectures. That's too bad, huh? Anyway, so I'm standing there and the secretary comes in with her boss and she wants to buy an IBM Selectric typewriter, which was one of the third or fourth iterations that they talked about in the Utterback book. So the Selectric was the one with the ball that rotated and you could do automatic corrections. So this was an incremental innovation over a regular typewriter, but it was a significant one for a lot of people, and the Selectric became the dominant design for typewriters for a very long time, and they overlapped. This is, you know, if you're looking here, this would be that Selectric typewriter overlapping with the PC, and it established itself and maintained a pretty strong space until, you know, it was very clear that the PC was going to come along. But in any event, we had this Selectric, and then IBM had introduced these new electronic typewriters. So it was a little bit of a computer, and what it did was it notified you when you'd spelled something incorrectly. So you're typing along, and all of a sudden you get this little beep, and you would know that you've typed this word incorrectly. The nice thing about this, and for those of you who have never used a typewriter, typewriters have, you know, spaces. So if, for instance, you've typed an extra letter, you've actually made that space on your paper bigger. And if you go back later and correct it, you know, with whiteout or something, you've got a space that's too big for the word that's left, right? So I typed in 5 letters, but the word is actually only 4. Now I've got this weird space here that doesn't look right. So the wheelwriter was able to actually notify the secretary when she typed the word incorrectly, and she could immediately go back and fix it, and therefore the spacing and the whole page was much neater. Well, this annoying beep, especially for, you know, for perhaps secretaries that frequently typed words incorrectly, was not acceptable to them. And they looked at it and they're just like, what is this? I don't want this. I want my Selectric. I want my Selectric. That's what they would say. I want my Selectric. So that was, you know, from the last video, that was the elephant inside these secretaries saying, no, I'm very emotionally attached to this Selectric, and that's what I want. I like the way that it feels. She would say, I like the way it feels when I push the button. It feels the way I want it. That's called tactile feel, which we really don't have anymore today because our computers are very soft, you know, the little keys and stuff. So you don't have that same tactile feel that these secretaries were so attached to. And you saw a lot of elephant behavior as opposed to the rider. You know, sometimes the bosses might say something like, well, yeah, that might be better, right? Because this means the document's going to come out faster, you know, because you're going to fix the mistakes instead of me having to fix them and then you having to go back and retype the whole thing. And so a lot of them saw that. But that elephant inside those secretaries was so strong. I never saw the boss win out. They always got the Selectric. It wasn't until the PC came along, and what really happened was when the PC came along, a lot of the middle managers, not necessarily, you know, the senior managers, because having a secretary was again a very emotional connection. You know, it wasn't just that she was typing letters and he could type himself, even though he might not be able to type, may not have learned to type. That secretary was a point of pride and status for that executive. So secretaries were not, you know, they didn't go away right away. A lot of them stayed, especially those that were in the senior levels. But when the middle managers took on these PCs, this invading product here that took over, not only was the typewriter industry disrupted, but the secretaries themselves were disrupted. So instead of just working for one middle manager, you might have 3 or 4 or 5 middle managers that you supported because they typed their own letters and you were, as a secretary, were just in charge of other things that had to be done. So there's a lot of disruption that takes place in that typewriter industry. For me, it was something that I was able to experience directly, and it was always fascinating to me to watch that disruption take place. Wasn't quite as fun for the secretaries, but it was really interesting to watch. So Utterback doesn't actually go into a lot of detail in Chapter 1 about this slide, because what we're seeing here is the companies that we talked about, they were optimizing their products. So you saw one type of product, and usually had to do with like mechanical or electrical, start to dominate the others. And that was that optimization. But then a new innovation would come along, and this was the word processors, or the PCs, and that would just completely disrupt that other product regardless of the optimization. So those incremental improvements were not enough to keep the new disruption, the new innovation at bay. And as a result of that, they were disrupted and they went away. One of the things that he mentions in chapter 1 toward the end is the surprise that IBM was actually able to stay in this game. And what he mentions, I want to make sure you guys read this, because I thought it was an important point that you'll see later on in the book, and there's a lot about this, in our reading. But let me see. Yeah. So on page 19, Utterback talks about the regaining of leadership by IBM's personal computer is unusual in this respect, as this firm was a dominant force in both electric typewriter and PC waves of innovation. Some might argue that IBM was merely the packager or distributor of the truly important innovations underlying the PC industry, namely the software and the microprocessors. So in this space, they give IBM a little bit of credit, because they were actually the dominant PC design. That became the dominant design, and from there lots of people dropped off. And that's something that you'll see more and more as we get more into Utterback. But as this dominant design is accepted in the market, and that is a market decision, regardless of whether it's better or not, the market decides on what the dominant design is, and then those that can't get to the dominant design just go away. And at this point, IBM actually had the dominant design, and I remember that. I remember having the IBM PC, and then the PC compatible, the IBM compatible PCs. And of course, at IBM, we would always scoff at it because it wasn't exactly the same. They were very close, but there would be little tiny things that would be different, and they were things that for us we would try to make a big point of. So people, decided to spend more money because the IBM compatible system, and Dell would be one of them, would be a lot less money. And so many companies were like, we'll deal with that because, it's half the price. In some cases, it might be half the price of the IBM, the actual IBM PC. So it was a very interesting time. There was a lot of disruption going on. And it was just very interesting to watch, companies try to optimize versus innovate, and what that did to them. At one point in the book, you see Utterback talking about the fact that Wang went out of business altogether, and I'm sure many of you have never even heard of Wang except Vera Wang. Wang was a great, big, huge producer of word processors, which was a big machine that sat by itself. It wasn't a small machine, and it would do you'd had the display and you could fix things and you could kind of read it over before you printed it off or went to the next one. So it was a great innovation over a typewriter, but it was never great, and it had sort of a small period of time before the PC came along. And once the PC came along and the software came along with it, Wang went out of business because they weren't able to make it through to the new world. And I'll tell you kind of a funny story that, my mother is not an early adopter of anything, but she worked for my dad for many years, and my dad was a safety consultant, so he had tons and tons of things to type up and write. And my mother did all the typing for him. And they were one of the, I would say they're probably early majority of PCs. My mother had a PC, and IBM actually created their own word processor called DisplayWrite, which predated Microsoft Word. So DisplayWrite was out for a very long time, many different versions of DisplayWrite, and it was a very innovative product at the time. But when Word came out, I was the first one to tell my mother, you've got to update to Word, Mom. It's got all these really neat functions, and what you see is what you get. And DisplayWrite was very slow compared to Word. And so I explained this to my mother. I said, you know, you don't even have to do what she actually had to do is after she typed everything, she would hit this button, and it was called paginating, which meant all of the indentations and all of the paragraphs and everything would come to place, and her document would look the way it was supposed to. Well, paginate, depending on the size of the document, could take like half an hour, 45 minutes, which was ridiculous. I mean, today we would never tolerate that. Now everything just works the way it's supposed to, and everything moves the way it's supposed to, and there's no extra step. So when I explained this to my mother, which was a huge feature, she said to me, well, that's ridiculous. How would I ever get any of the housework done? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she said, well, I type up the document for your father, and then I hit paginate, and she's got like half an hour, 40 minutes. And she would go up and do the laundry or make dinner or something like that. And so this space of time where she hit this button was very important to her. And that was her level of status quo bias. Like, there's no way I'm switching over because I'm never going to get anything else done. So I thought it was hilarious. I've never forgotten this conversation I had with my mother. But, you know, so I was not able to convince her to go to Word. She did end up going to it, but only because IBM did away with DisplayWrite, because Word took over and DisplayWrite became completely obsolete. So she had to eventually move, but her justification was very much the elephant, right? Even though there's some logic in there, right? She had other things she had to do, and this was the time she did it. But this was her very emotional elephant saying, there's no way I'm moving off this software. I've learned it, it's very effective, and I've, you know, put my day around it. So anyway, lots of different things, you know, to think about when you're talking about optimizing or innovating. And this is just a great book, and I think you guys will enjoy it. So that's it for Utterback, and the next couple will address the other books. Thanks. Bye-bye.